Chapter 14. Mainly political and financial. Except for that involuntary twitch of the eyelids, Superintendent Battle's impassivity was unimpaired. If he had been surprised at Virginia's recognition of Anthony, he did not show it. He and Lord Caterham stood together and watched those two go out through the garden door. Mr. Fish also watched them. "Nice young fellow, that," said Lord Caterham. "Very nice for Miss Rebel to meet an old friend," muttered the American. "They have been acquainted some time, presumably?" "Seems so," said Lord Caterham, "but I've never heard her mention him before. Oh, by the way, Battle, Mr. Lomax has been asking for you. He's in the blue morning room." "Very good, Lord Caterham. I'll go there at once." Battle found his way to the blue morning room without difficulty. He was already familiar with the geography of the house. "Ah, there you are, Battle," said Lomax. He was striding impatiently up and down the carpet. There was only one other person in the room, a big man sitting in a chair by the fireplace. He was dressed in very correct English shooting clothes, which nevertheless sat strangely upon him. He had a fat yellow face, and black eyes, as impenetrable as those of a cobra. There was a generous curve to the big nose, and power in the square lines of the vast jaw. "Come in, Battle," said Lomax irritably, "and shut the door behind you. This is Mr. Herman Isaacson." Battle inclined his head respectfully. He knew all about Mr. Herman Isaacson, and though the great financier sat there silent whilst Lomax strode up and down and talked, he knew who was the real power in the room. "We can speak more freely now," said Lomax. "Before Lord Caterham and Colonel Melrose, I was anxious not to say too much. You understand, Battle? These things mustn't get about." "Ah," said Battle, "but they always do. More's the pity." Just for a second he saw a trace of a smile on the fat yellow face. It disappeared as suddenly as it had come. "Now, what do you really think of this young fellow, this Anthony Cade?" continued George. "Do you still assume him to be innocent?" Battle shrugged his shoulders very slightly. "He tells a straight story. Part of it we shall be able to verify. On the face of it, it accounts for his presence here last night. I shall cable to South America, of course, for information about his antecedents." "Then you shall regard him as cleared of all complacency?" Battle raised a large square hand. "Not so fast, sir. I never said that." "What is your own idea about the crime, Superintendent Battle?" asked Isaacson, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep and rich, and had a certain compelling quality about it. It stood him in good stead at board meetings in his younger days. "It's rather too soon to have ideas, Mr. Isaacson. I've not got beyond asking myself the first question." "What is that?" "Oh, it's always the same. Motive. Who benefits by the death of Prince Michael? We've got to answer that before we can get anywhere." "The Revolutionary Party of Czechoslovakia," began George. Superintendent Battle waved him aside with something less than his usual respect. "It wasn't the comrades of the Red Hand, sir, if you're thinking of them, but the paper with the scarlet hand on it?" "Put there to suggest the obvious solution." George's dignity was a little ruffled. "Really, Battle, I don't see how you can be so sure of that." "Bless you, Mr. Lomax, we all know about the comrades of the Red Hand. We've had our eye on them ever since Prince Michael landed in England. That sort of thing is the elementary work of the department. They'd never be allowed to get within a mile of him." "I agree with Superintendent Battle," said Isaacson. "We must look elsewhere." "You see, sir," said Battle, encouraged by his support, "we do know a little about the case. If we don't know who gains by his death, we do know who loses by it." "Meaning?" said Isaacson. His black eyes were bent upon the detective. More than ever, he reminded Battle of a hooded cobra. "You and Mr. Lomax, not to mention the loyalist party of Czechoslovakia. If you pardon the expression, sir, you're in the soup." "Really, Battle," interposed George, shocked to the core. "Go on, Battle," said Isaacson, "and this soup describes the situation very accurately. You're an intelligent man. You've got to have a king. You've lost your king. Like that." He snapped his large fingers. "You've got to find another in a hurry, and that's not an easy job. No, I don't want to know the details of your scheme. The bare outline is enough for me. But I take it it's a big deal?" Isaacson bent his head very slowly. "It's a very big deal." "That brings me to my second question. Who is the next heir to the throne of Czechoslovakia?" Isaacson looked across at Lomax. The latter answered the question with a certain reluctance, and a good deal of hesitation. "That would be, I should say, yes. In all probability, Prince Nicholas would be the next heir." "Ah," said Battle. "And who is Prince Nicholas?" "A first cousin of Prince Michael's." "Ah," said Battle, "I should like to hear all about Prince Nicholas, especially where he is at present." "Nothing much is known of him," said Lomax. "As a young man, he was most particular in his ideas, consorted with socialists and republicans, and acted in a way unbecoming to his position. He was sent down from Oxford, I believe, for some wild escapade. There was a rumor of his death 2 years ago later in the Congo, but it was only a rumor. He turned up a few months ago when the news of the royalist reaction got about." "Indeed?" said Battle. "Where did he turn up?" "In America." "America?" Battle turned to Isaacson with one laconic word. "Oil?" The financier nodded. He represented that if the Slovakias chose a king, they would prefer him to Prince Michael as being more sympathetic with modern enlightened ideas, and he drew attention to his early democratic views and his sympathy with republican ideals. In return for financial support, he was prepared to grant concessions to a certain group of American financiers. Superintendent Battle so far forgot his habitual impassivity as to give vent to a prolonged whistle. "So that it is," he muttered. "In the meantime, the Loyalist party supported Prince Michael, and you'd felt sure you'd come out on top. And then this happens." "You surely don't think—" began George. "It was a big deal," said Battle. "Mr. Isaacson said so. And I should say what he calls a big deal is a big deal." "There are always unscrumptious tools to be got a hold of," said Isaacson quietly. "For the moment, Wall Street wins. But they're not done with me yet. Find out who killed Prince Michael, Superintendent Battle, if you want to do your country a service." "One thing strikes me as highly suspicious," put in George. "Why the equerry, Captain of Embassy? Why not come down with the prince yesterday?" "I've inquired into that," said Battle. "It's perfectly simple. He stayed in town to make arrangements with a certain lady on behalf of Prince Michael for next weekend. The Baron rather frowned on such things, thinking them injudicious at the present stage of affairs, so His Highness had to go about them in a hole-and-corner manner. He was, if I may say so, inclined to be a rather dissipated young man." "I'm afraid so," said George ponderously. "Yes, I'm afraid so. There's one other point we ought to take into account, I think," said Battle, speaking with a certain amount of hesitation. "King Victor's supposed to be in England." "King Victor?" Lomax frowned in an effort of recollection. "Notorious French crook, sir. We've had a warning from the Sweat in Paris." "Of course," said George. "I remember now. Jewel thief, isn't he? Why, that's the man." He broke off abruptly. Isaacson, who had been frowning abstractly at the fireplace, looked up just too late to catch the warning glance telegraphed from Superintendent Battle to the other, but being a man sensitive to vibrations in the atmosphere, he was conscious of a sense of strain. "You don't want me any longer, do you, Lomax?" he inquired. "No, thank you, my dear fellow." "Would it upset your plans if I returned to London, Superintendent Battle?" "I'm afraid so, sir," said the superintendent civilly. "You see, if you go, there will be others who want to go also, and that would never do." "Quite so." The great financier left the room, closing the door behind him. "Splendid fellow, Isaacson," muttered George Lomax perfunctorily. "Very powerful personality," agreed Superintendent Battle. George began to pace up and down again. "What you say disturbs me greatly," he began. "King Victor. I thought he was in prison." "Came out a few months ago. French police meant to keep on his heels, but he managed to give them the slip straight away. He would, too. One of the coolest customers that ever lived. For some reason or another, they believe he's in England, and have notified us to that effect." "But what would he be doing in England?" "That's for you to say, sir," said Battle significantly. You think... You know the story, of course. Ah, yes, I see that you do. I was not in office, of course, at the time, but I heard the whole story from the late Lord Caterham. An unparalleled catastrophe." "The Koh-i-Noor," said Battle reflexively. "Hush, Battle." George glanced suspiciously round him. "I beg of you, mention no names. Much better not. If you speak of it, call it the K." The superintendent looked wooden again. "You don't connect King Victor with this crime, do you, Battle?" "It's just a possibility, that's all. If you'll cast your mind back, sir, you'll remember that there were 4 places where a certain royal visitor might have concealed the jewel. Chimneys was one of them. King Victor was arrested in Paris 3 days after the disappearance, if I may call it that, of the K. It was always hoped that he would some day lead us to the jewel. But the Chimneys has been ransacked and overhauled a dozen times." "Yes," said Battle sapiently, "but it's never much good looking when you don't know where to look. Only suppose now that this King Victor came here to look for the thing, was surprised by Prince Michael and shot him." "It's possible," said George, "a most likely solution of the crime." "I won't go as far as that. It's possible, but not much more." "Why is that?" "Because King George has never known to take a life," said Battle seriously. "Oh, but a man like that, a dangerous criminal—" Battle shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. "Criminals always act true to type, Mr. Lomax. It's surprising. All the same." "Yes. I'd rather like to question the prince's servant. I left him purposely to the last. We'll have him in here, sir, if you don't mind." George signified his assent. The superintendent rang the bell. Treadwell answered it, and departed with his instructions. He returned shortly, accompanied by a tall, fair man with high cheekbones, and very deep-set blue eyes, and a passivity of countenance which almost rivaled Battle's. Boris Anochakov? Yes. You were valet to Prince Michael? I was his Highness's valet, yes. The man spoke good English, though with a markedly harsh foreign accent. You know that your master was murdered last night? A deep snarl, like the snarl of a wild beast, was the man's only answer. It alarmed George, who withdrew prudently towards the window. When did you see your master last? His Highness retired to bed at 10:30. I slept as always in the anteroom next to him. He must have gone down to the room downstairs by the other door, the door that I gave onto the corridor. I did not hear him go. It may be that I was drugged. I have been an unfaithful servant. I slept while my master woke. I am accursed. George gazed at him, fascinated. You loved your master, eh? Said Battle, watching the man closely. Boris's features contracted painfully. He swallowed twice. Then his voice came harsh with emotion. I say this to you, English policeman. I would have died for him, and since he is dead and I still live, my eyes shall not know sleep or my heart rest until I have avenged him. Like a dog, I will nose out his murderer, and when I have discovered him, His eyes lit up. Suddenly he drew an immense knife from beneath his coat and brandished it aloft. Not all at once will I kill him, oh no. First I will slit his nose, and cut off his ears, and put out his eyes, and then into his black heart I will thrust this knife. Swiftly he replaced the knife, and turning left the room. George Lomax, his eyes always protuberant, but now goggling almost out of his head, stared at the closed door. Purebred Hero-Slovakian, of course, he muttered. Most uncivilized people. A waste of brigands. Superintendent Battle rose alertly to his feet. Either that man's sincere, he remarked, or he's the best bluffer I've ever seen. And if it's the former, God help Prince Michael's murderer when that human bloodhound gets a hold of him.